Hi everyone, and welcome to Chick Talk. I'm Gray Parks, nutritionist for Protrition Feeds, and I'm here today to talk to you about feeding meat birds. There's been a lot of interest, especially lately, about people wanting to raise their own chickens, raise their own meat at home for many reasons, from food security to just knowing where your food comes from and having control over what goes into your food. But you may not be familiar with how to raise meat birds, especially how to raise them that might be different from what you're used to if you've had layers or ducks or that sort of thing. The most important thing to keep in mind about the difference between layer chicks and meat chicks is how much faster a true meat bird is going to grow than a typical layer pullet will. These chicks, if you're buying the Cornish cross, so the typical commercial broiler type chick, are going to be at harvest weight at around 6 to 8 weeks of age, depending on how fast they grow in your situation. So they're going to grow at roughly double the rate that you're used to seeing in your typical layered chicks. You want to make sure that the housing and feeders and waterers you have for them can accommodate that rapid growth, because they will quickly outgrow a typical newborn chick brooder if you're not prepared for that. You may also be raising more ranger type broilers, so they might be called red rangers, freedom rangers, gray broilers. These are not as rapidly growing as a typical Cornish cross will, and they'll be ready for finishing around 10 to 12 weeks of age. So the first step is knowing what kind of meat chicks that you have. Particularly with the Cornish cross traditional broiler chicks, you have to control how you feed those chicks and when you feed them to make sure they don't grow too quickly to become too fatty to be a healthful, useful meal, or to cause injuries and illnesses to themselves, like bruises and lesions along their breastbones and even broken limbs from eating and growing too fast. So how do we want to manage these chicks? Well, the first thing is to think about space for your meat birds. Initially, a broiler chick needs about 2 square feet of floor space per chick. But by the time they reach slaughter age, you're going to be looking at more like 4 square feet per bird. So make sure you have room for that expansion. These chicks will, just like your layer pullets, need a heat source initially when they come to you. But most broilers will be large enough and feathered enough to be completely off of their heat source by about 4 weeks of age, assuming you have them in a climate-controlled area that's around 70 degrees or warmer when you're raising them. You want to make sure that your feeders and waterers for these birds allow them at least 2 inches of linear space per bird when they're brand new, up to 4 inches per bird when they're adults. So is there plenty of room for them all to eat at one time and all to access their water? A common question is, how much feed will these birds eat? Typically, in the time that it takes you to raise a Cornish cross broiler to finish, you're looking at somewhere between 5 and 10 pounds of feed per bird. Again, depending on what size you want to process those birds. So that can help you plan your feed purchases for those birds. You also want to allow initially 1 gallon of water per 50 birds in your pen, and as they get closer to finish, 1 gallon per 10 birds. With these meat birds in particular, we want them to grow at the most optimum rate. And with chickens, if you restrict their water, then they will self-restrict their feed intake. So it's very important that clean, fresh water is available at all times for your meat birds. With these chickens, that probably means you're going to have to clean and empty and refill their waters twice a day, especially if you have waters that allow the chicks to kick shavings into their water, because they do tend to be a lot messier than your layer pullets. Similarly, you'll probably have to clean their bedding and replace their bedding much more frequently than you do your layer chicks, both because of their increased size and, again, they do tend to be messy. With feeders, as these meat birds age, you want to raise them up to the level of the chick's back. So initially that means just any kind of feeder on the ground. Half of an egg carton or a typical chick feeder tray will work great. And as they get bigger, you want to lift that and lift that. Otherwise, you will get a lot of feed waste with these birds. For the first 2 weeks of a meat chicken's life, you want to make sure you're providing a very high protein, high nutrient type diet like our co-op meat bird starter and grower. After 2 weeks, if you want to slow down their growth to grow your birds out to a larger size, then the all-natural chick starter with a lower protein, lower nutrient content is acceptable. But when you're looking for maximizing inputs and minimizing the amount of time you're growing the birds, then you want to stay on that meat bird starter grower for the entirety of their grow out cycle. When your chicks get to be about 3 weeks of age or so, especially if you're trying to slow their growth a bit, you'll want to take their feed away at night. So 12 hours a day access to feed, 12 hours a day no access to feed. Because some of these birds can literally eat themselves to death if you allow them 24/7 access to their feed, especially if they're under 24/7 light, because they won't sleep at night. They'll just continue to eat and eat and eat. So when you're raising your meat birds, you want to make sure you've planned for the size they're going to grow out to, have plenty of space in your brooder and your grow out pens for your meat birds. Know if you're feeding a Cornish cross broiler or a more mobile, slower growing Freedom Ranger type broiler, so you can pick the right feed at the right time for these birds and ensure them the healthiest, most comfortable life they can during the time that you're growing them out. Thanks for tuning in to Chick Talk. Again, my name is Gray Parks. Feel free to reach out to me directly with any questions about raising your birds.